But what's interesting about that period is that although the state is putting out all these feelers about negotiations, they are as repressive as ever. Lots of people in detention, lots of state attacks on people in their public gatherings, people, lots of assassinations, people disappearing, people being killed. In fact, we had worse conditions, and yet we woke up in the 80s with a spring in our step. We had severe repression. We had states of emergency where hundreds of people thrown in detention. As long as we can get there and have that vote, once we have that base and that platform, we will use the standing we have, the electoral support we have, the space in Parliament to move forward on the issues that were mentioned in the, at that time we were calling it the RDP document, and which came from the Freedom Charter. In fact, part of why the RDP office then was abolished was that many ministers who were ministers in their own right complained to Thabo Mbeki that they did not like to have a department in the office of the president, I suppose, towering over them and looking over their shoulder at what they're doing. They objected.
Hello everybody, welcome to the Southfield Soul. Today I'm sharing a very special discussion that I had with a colleague and a comrade and a friend, Frank Meintjies. It's going to be offered in two parts because our discussion took over 2 hours. But the purpose of this video is to provide a baseline for future discussions. What I mean by that is this video looks at the time just before the New South Africa and into the New South Africa, and I asked the questions: what was happening just before the build-up to the 1994 elections and to the release of political prisoners? What was going on in the country? What happened in the country just after that? And then what was it like being in government at that time? What were the things that a new Black government had to rectify, had to address in order to bring about a stable South Africa, I guess? And the idea behind this is to offer a fair baseline, as fair as possible. Of course, we all have our own viewpoints. Baseline from which we can then interrogate issues further, whether they are critical of government or supportive or challenging and providing suggested solutions. So the idea here is to provide that baseline so that we can then start talking about issues and confronting issues. And I'd love to do that here. So the person that I'm speaking to is Frank Meintjies. So Frank has been involved in the struggle. He's been involved in social justice work, I think, all his working life. And he's currently a visiting research fellow at Wits University. He was the director of Hlanganisa Institute of Development and the national coordinator of Mandela Day. But more significantly for this discussion, Frank was the Chief Director of Communications and Human Resource Development in the government's RDP office. So he along with that office, played a really, really vital role in the first days of the New South Africa and the first few years of the New South Africa. So Frank was crucial to this discussion. Yeah, so more than that though, Frank is a genuine human being. He's just a really lovely human being, you know. He offers a measured and an honest reflection of what it was like in those first few days and months and years, what they wanted to achieve, what they tried to achieve, and the shortcomings, where government has failed, basically. But so I hope you will enjoy this video. It's like I said, it's in two parts because it was too long to put in one video. And this is part one. I hope to have part two up possibly by the end of the week. But for now, enjoy this. I know you will really, I absolutely enjoyed chatting with Frank. He has such a gentle but strong way of asserting his views. Yes, and I think there's so much that we can learn from this discussion. So thanks for being here. I hope you enjoy. Please give feedback. So Frank, firstly, just looking back at the first democratic elections, but just take us just a little way back to what was the feeling, what led up to it, what was the mood, what was going on?
I think, yeah, that's really important, Gladys, because I think you have to start from the 80s. I know in this week people were talking about the 76 as being that key turning point, but it goes together with what happened in the 80s. Huge swath of mobilization across the country. But at the same time, there was something interesting happening behind the scenes, because already from about the mid-80s, Mandela was moved to Paulsmoor. And there was some talk from P.W. Botha that if he in fact agrees to renounce violence and also move back to Kunu, then he would be released from prison. And Mandela said no. And there was this huge rally in Soweto in 85 where Zimzi spoke and read Mandela's letter. And Mandela said, as long as the people of this country are under the conditions they are in, being out of prison for me would not be being free. He rejected that out of hand. Behind the scenes were also people maneuvering. There was around that period also a meeting at the Ford Foundation with some Broederbond people in the mid-80s. After that, there were some academics who went to Lusaka, probably around the 85 period as well. Academics from the Afrikaner community as well as from the editors. But what's interesting about that period is that although the state is putting out all these feelers about negotiations, they are as repressive as ever, because we are in the streets and we are mobilizing. So it's a typical divide and rule strategy. Can I find somebody who we can deal with on the other side? But in fact, these masses that are uprising, we are hitting them hard. We are hammering them. Lots of people in detention. Lots of state attacks on people in their public gatherings. People, lots of assassinations. People disappearing. People being killed. By the late 90s, though, there had been about 3 years of talks with the head, a guy called Kobi Kutsia of the Correctional Services with Mandela. They're trying to find a way forward. But these conditions that government was putting were still holding. But by 89, PW was starting to set up a meeting with Mandela. But then he had a stroke. So although he had that stroke and then he had a meeting with Mandela, but not about his release.
Yes.
He then fell by the wayside because political events within the National Party overtook, and then de Klerk came to power. And by the late 89, de Klerk had met with Mandela and reached some agreements about his release. And Mandela had also by then had written to them himself saying, I am requesting, in fact, discussions with you about a negotiated transition. And then 1990, Mandela was released. In that period now, we are still on the streets. Many, many people are being killed, being detained. Assassinations are continuing. Inkatha has been used in a low level throughout the 80s, but it's increasing. And it reaches a great height in the early 91 period after Inkatha decides to become a national political party. And because they're hearing that there might be elections. They're starting to form a base in the Transvaal, and the train killings start. The attacks from the right wing starts as well. Remember, there was someone called Baron Witwatersrand, who shot people in Pretoria. The state's attacks on people in stadiums. I think at one stage in Sebokeng, about 16 people were killed. The covert activities continue with people in the state actually arming Inkatha, giving them arms. There were attacks on in the Transkei and Bantu Hlanganisa. There were various people continuing to disappear. Meanwhile, these talks are continuing, starting off with very formal things like when can the detainees come back into the exiles come back into the country? How can detainees be released? How can we set up a system for talks? So in fact, CODESA started, I think, at the end of 1991, December 1991. So this thing of parallel processes going together. The mood on the masses, from the masses on the ground, was always buoyant. We always had a spring in our step. And when you look at people today, some activists, you see how heavy and how tired they are. And you say, it cannot be that the circumstances and conditions around you can make you so drained of energy, because in fact we had worse conditions, and yet we woke up in the 80s with a spring in our step. We had severe repression. We had states of emergency where hundreds of people thrown in detention, but we never said that we are depressed. We are actually lacking in energy to mobilize. We are confused or uncertain about which way to go. But now that is the case. You remember the period when we had the state capture, the 9 years of Zuma, how despondent many activists were. But those are the things that carried us. And what was also very interesting, that is, was how, in fact, this mobilization occurred at so many different levels. So internationally, obviously, the people like Thabo Mbeki and others were actually engaging the governments internationally. But it came all the way down to the grassroots level in many, many communities. Whether the community was somewhere in Paris or somewhere in Huhudi, you found there was a small civic association. You found there was a particular women's group. You found there were youth structures, COSAS. You found a faith group. You found also in the sports groups, the SECOS. Everyone was there. They were coming together. It was just incredible. And one of the things that people need to learn today when they organize is how do we organize around a broader front as possible. So when you go to somebody else who doesn't agree with you, they might be faith-based or they might be in sports, they say to you, I want to go this far in the journey, and then you say to them, but actually I want to go a lot further. But let's walk together up to that point. And when you get to that point, what's interesting is that because you've established integrity, trust, values with each other, many people go much further, like the detainees' parent support committees, which were sometimes liberal. Many of them became activists in their own right. So we've lost a lot of those tactics and strategies, and that's why the fees must fall. Many times the young people in those struggles were on their own. They hadn't built those broader alliances. So by the time the elections came now, so let's just talk about some of the topics that came up in the discussion. So CODESA, one, mainly talked about the constitution, a new constitution. It talked about an interim government. It talked about what to do about the homelands. And then it talked about, I suppose, the time sequence for all the steps. And then it talked about electoral processes. You will realize that in all of those discussions there is not a lot of discussion about sort of the burning issues like education, like the quality of life of people, like the kind of economic exclusion that exists among the masses of people, like, for example, the I guess the way in which the education and welfare system and health systems were structured.
Yes.
So in CODESA, they agreed on I guess, a statement of commitment of everyone. So the first thing they agreed on is that they wanted an election that included everyone. The second, they said we must all strive to have quality of life for everyone. Then the third point they made was that they would all work together to ensure the elections are peaceful, peaceful elections, and that then they would all work together to report back to their constituencies. So the only point there which related to the conditions of people was this thing that we will strive for the improvement. Yes. We, all parties gathered here, will strive for the improvement in the quality of life of people. And then you must see the ANC's position there. You're so busy with the mechanics. When are people returning in 1991 from exile, what circumstances? Who will be released from prison? In fact, that was the last one, and from which prisons, the mechanics around that. And then they got into the debates around the resistance of the National Party and right wing, who said, this majority rule is a problem to us unless it has certain safeguards for minorities. We want certain veto rights. We want certain federal arrangements so that regional powers exist. And there are these fights, and that's how CODESA broke down on those issues, not on the issues over which we had been fighting since '76, like education, how that would be transformed in the economy. Very interesting. And then you then had this huge violence. So again, something distracting us from negotiating about the fundamental transformation. So instead of us talking about, well, what are ways in which we will transfer wealth and transfer land, we're talking about violence. 1992, Mandela then blows up and walks out because of the violence. Because I guess there was a Sebokeng attack on people at a mass rally. There was there were these train attacks which were increasing. Mandela then called a halt. And then there was following that, there was this mass action in the Ciskei, because Mandela said, I'm walking out of this, let's have some mass activity on the ground. And people went into a stadium in the Ciskei, and then they opened fire on people. And it was a really tragic event. Many people died. So in 1992, that rest of the whole year, now there was this violence escalating. There are no talks. And that's when Cyril and Rolf Meyer came back in. And they then said, well, actually, let's try and restart this thing. And they started a little bit of CODESA 2, but then that also collapsed. And eventually, it was only a bilateral between the ANC and the National Party and not the other groups. Eventually, in about 1993, they called a multi-party national forum. And the ANC and the National Party were together presenting proposals. And that's what cheesed Nkatha off. And they then decided to escalate violence and walk out of the talks. They only returned to the talks on the eve of the elections. And that was because of the involvement, I think, of the British. They negotiated, and Mandela went to the king of the Zulus and said, look, we will give you a special status, and we will negotiate with Nkatha later about their request for some kind of federal arrangement. And so it was in that context now we were going to vote. In 1992, there was also mobilization from the right wing. So de Klerk was under pressure. So he then held a referendum with the white community, and he asked them, are you in favor of reform? And he got 60%. So in 1992 as well, there was such delays in the talks because the white right wing were undermining the base of de Klerk so people were being distracted by right wing issues.
Yeah.
But the mood was buoyant, and we knew that we must press ahead, that we knew that once we get there, and this was Mandela's narrative, his line, his articulation of where we were at, that as long as we can get there and have that vote, once we have that base and that platform, we will use the standing we have, the electoral support we have, the space in Parliament to move forward on the issues that were mentioned in the, at that time we were calling it the RDP document, and which came from the Freedom Charter, which was a number of issues. One of them was protecting people against violence. The next was education and skills. The next was an adequate health system. The next was a properly functioning economy. Those were the key points within the RDP document and the arrangement. And with that document, Mandela moved us into government, and it was such excitement. And you found people who, old grannies who never thought they would see this day, hobbling up to the election thing to vote. And you found that, people were in the streets, they were excited, they never believed this day would come. It was a triumph of hope over repression, over suffering, over moments of being disillusioned as well. And you can imagine for Mandela, I mean, go back to Mandela, 1960, you walk into a prison cell and your colleagues are very despondent, and you say to them, don't be despondent, we will be free. And there's no shred of evidence in what he's saying. All these circumstances around him run completely against that statement. But that is what some people might call the word faith, but I call it radical hope.
Yes.
Radical hope, because if you have evidence or that something will be happening, that's prediction. It's not hope. It's not this thing which says there's something about where I'm standing and where I am that I know that some things might come together. And because we'll be in the right place, those small cracks that will happen, we'll be at that right point with the right energies to move into those cracks and to widen them. And Martin Luther King said the same thing. He said, the arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I think a similar thing with the fall of the Berlin Wall. It had been there for ages. Nobody would predict when it would fall. And the same thing for women who work on gender-based violence or against patriarchy. Imagine if that woman said, I'm only going to be active and participate in the march and the mobilization if you can tell me a precise date when patriarchy will end. Yeah. But in fact, we work and we move forward and we march, not because we know a precise date or because we have evidence, but we know the thing we're working on. We have that sense of radical hope that because of the ways in which things work and come together, and because things are so uncertain and predictable, it's within that thing of not knowing that in fact there are possibilities. Yeah. So it was I guess one comparison we can make around the mood and the feeling we had at that time was when we had the World Cup.
Yes.
During the period of the World Cup, remember South Africans. Yeah. In fact, if you were coming from Spain or somewhere and you came to Johannesburg or to Durban to stadium, you met these South Africans. They exuded such a liveliness, a vibrancy, and a connection between them as well, which I read a piece the other day by someone from one of the other countries, said, when I came to South Africa, I didn't think that people would be so together, would be so cohesive, would have so much warmth between each other, because I had heard of what South Africans, black and white, were like, and I was completely surprised. Yeah. And that's the point about when you're having something that's positive, that's forward-looking, that's transformative, that's visionary, is that the relationship between people. Okay, we have our conflicts, even in 2010, white people, black people, there are their tensions, but in fact, the proportion of stuff that is about your common humanity is raised when you're in that mode. And we were all in that mode. It was a fabulous time.
Yeah, it was. But Frank, so there was so much negotiated, so much compromise that had to happen, right? And some would say too much compromise. What do you think about that? And maybe what the alternatives, what were the possibilities, do you think?
So I think that the thing when you're understanding South Africa, you must always be able to hold two truths in your hand to work with ambiguity. So the one truth is that the things we were striving for, starting from Spring 76, and why I'm starting there, I'm saying the things that we were articulating from the ground through our own means, our own struggles, our own media, and drawing obviously on the older texts, but that we were articulating, and in the 80s, were very, very clear. These were things about the conditions under which our people were living in communities. It was, even in the 80s, heightened poverty, heightened unemployment. We were very concerned about the apartheid education system. We were angry about people being banished off land. These things did not come into the negotiation. So truth that we did not, in fact, change the agenda of the negotiations enough in order to push through in a strong way certain concessions from the other side about how, in fact, we would then transform the economy. So a few other areas which we didn't actually put on the table. So we didn't put on the table the work and the practice and the behavior of the judiciary in the last sort of 15 years or before the election, 20 years. We didn't put on the table the role of the media, although the SABC did come up and it was part of the negotiations and they had some interim arrangements there as well. So there were many things which we essentially didn't do. So that is true. How did we shape that the kind of agenda, the menu of issues under discussion? But also true was the fact that, as I'm saying, these issues of the escalation of violence had been introduced purposefully by the other side to create these distractions and to create points at which the whole thing would collapse. And secondly, the right-wing groups were also mobilizing and were being given the space to organize, so again causing a huge distraction there. And then there was the violence and repression at the mass level. So there were all these other issues which meant that the entire negotiations had to deal with these, I suppose, technical things, issues around peace, issues around the barriers to what would be in the way of, a majority rule. So they were creating these obstacles all the time about what would be the reasons that this right wing, small in number, minority number, but majority in certain resources they had, power and also financial resources. If we do not see particular things being elements of this settlement, we would actually pull back and we would destroy it from within. So there were these two realities, and in a way we must be open to hearing the critique about, in fact, not having compromised so much, but we must also hear the realities with which those who negotiated dealt. I think your question, what could we have done differently? So one of the important things you can do when you're in such situations is to turn to the people and the masses, and we didn't do that sufficiently. At one point we did it briefly after the Boipatong massacre, and then we had I guess, that mass mobilization in the Ciskei, and then there was that violent attack, and then there was that retreat. But prior to that and after that, the main line we were getting from the African National Congress was that we should demobilize, that in fact we should leave it to our representatives in these discussions and negotiations, instead of a different approach, which would be that in fact we need you to organize and mobilize to back us up. And so if you look at how things changed when they changed in the Philippines, there were masses of people in the streets working to dislodge a dictator. So out of the 92 organizations who met in CODESA 1, the United Democratic Front was not there. It was in a way told to stand down. What was there was many of the homeland parties. What was there was the Labour Party of South Africa and the Colored Community, and parties which were sort of in the Indian tricameral arrangement. And then what was there was some right-wing parties, and also these new groups merging, the Solidarity. And so we were only represented in that one way and that one sense. Interestingly, in that first CODESA, ZAPO stayed out of it, and also the Pan-African Congress. The Pan-African Congress changed and came back in, and then was in the first election, but ZAPO stayed out. So Europe, in this arrangement in CODESA, where in fact many of these 92 organizations want to side with the National Party, Inkatha being one of them. In fact, it was only in 1993 that the National Party abandoned the idea of an alliance with Inkatha to outmaneuver the ANC and to get more votes. They abandoned that, and they began to make this alliance through Cyril Ramaphosa and Rolf Meyer, and to work jointly. So in that context, we did not use our mass base well enough and sufficiently to, in fact, have particular mass actions that could have been peaceful. They would have been articulating our demands, as people are doing now. They have their placards, they say Black Lives Matter. People have their particular placards and banners around particular issues they're facing around climate change today. They're asserting their views around that, and the same on food security and food sovereignty. In the 90s period, we on the mass base should have been allowed, in fact, to be outside CODESA to say what our issues were. But such was the opportunity we lost. Lastly, I guess I should say that at the time, we had something called development forums in every community, local development forums and provincial development forums. And these structures were also told to disband and to make way for the party structures, so the local branch structures of the ANC. So we lost the initiative there in a way, but it wasn't all lost. We still had a lot going for us. One of the things that Joe Slovo brought out towards the late 90s, also looking at how precarious the talks and the negotiations were, and the possible descent into violence, he came up with the idea of a sunset clause. So the sunset clause was then used to quieten down the right-wingers and the National Party, the far right within the National Party, and to appease them. But that lasted for 9 years as well. So we had a lot of scope then from there on to build forward. We hadn't put anything in place regarding the economy and economic transformation, but with all other levers of the state, we had some possibilities.
Yeah. And Frank, would it be fair to talk a bit now about maybe the role of white capital? Or I think lots of people don't want to own the fact that had a lot of power, still has, you know, that historical advantage. And you're moving into a new country, really, and the money will come from those that are currently in power. It's not going to come easily, and perhaps I'm not asking that clearly, but I think you get what I'm saying. What are your thoughts on that?
So I think, yeah, so if ever there was I guess, a blind spot on the part of Nelson Mandela, of Madiba, was an overemphasis on the political transformation. So when you have political liberation and you don't have economic liberation, you really have a serious problem. Firstly, in relation to your own credibility and leadership, because you want to do transformative things, but you lack the resources. Then secondly, in relation to the mass of people, because, they have an understanding that liberation means my life will be better. That when I vote, it's not just going to the polls to put that vote and mark and be happy that actually I have a representative who's the same color as me. But it will improve my life fundamentally. So, so many years on, the reality for most people is that we have had a formal change, formal but not a substantive change, a substantive transformation. And these kinds of things, if you leave the economic negotiation and transformation behind, leads people to have to develop a lack of faith in democracy. Because they say, if I have democracy, it would improve my life. But if my life is as bad and sometimes even worse, when I get democracy can't mean anything. So that was not put on the table, and I think that also shows you the motivation and the incentive then for people from, I suppose, the white community, the white group, to participate in the negotiations and embrace it and embrace the transition. The wonderful incentive for them was this economic structure would remain untouched. And so that together with the issue of the land was not asserted, was not really clarified much, and there wasn't any signposts, any clear principles, any clear goals and objectives set around that. And so the privileged have remained privileged, and so it just continues generation to generation through a number of things. But Piketty has actually analyzed how this works in society, and he talks about the ways in which those in society who have a lot of assets in a number of ways pass it on to the next generation and the next generation. So one of them is the ways in which I suppose they kickstart their young, with getting them off into business, the young married couples, giving them a head start, and then it's through the system of inheritance.
Yes.
And so when you look at South Africa today, 20 million people, when we started this battle against the COVID-19 virus, 20 million people were part of a group or category we would call the vulnerable. Those are the people who we don't even need to distinguish whether some are working, some are not working in that group, some on grants, but where if they cannot earn from month to month, they in fact sink below the level and go into the ultra poor, don't have enough to eat, literally can face starvation and famine. And so that's the amount. We already have 17 million people on social grants. And then we have a lot of other people who are in the informal economy. So they do survive under normal circumstances, but it's month by month survival.
Yes.
So it means that I do this maybe month by month, maybe every 2 weeks, but I get a wage, I get something in and I'll use it and I'll spend it and then I'll survive for the next month. And then I spread it around, a kind of internal kind of remittances. But cut that off and you realize how on the edge, 20 million, this is like half of South Africans. So post-COVID, we can expect that the numbers of people who will be in that group will increase more because fewer businesses will open, and then less people will be employed. There'll be all the layoffs. So that's going to, and one of the risks we face in many of our major cities, but particularly where people are mobilized and there are large crowds, we face the risks of food riots in the cities in the next 6 months, the next 8 months. We do see that possibility of uprisings. So the way the government is addressing that now is to try and trickle in like a 350 rand, a month for people, which also is not flowing to people. We are handling it with a lot of soup kitchens, and then there's a lot of food parcels, but the majority of those food parcels, or in equal numbers, coming from the NGOs. In places like Mpopo, there are hardly food parcels. So all of this goes back to CODESA and the negotiations and the thing around the economy. And the restructuring of the economy, the redistribution of resources. How would you look at the tax system? How would you then look at things? Even then, we should have been talking in those negotiations about a basic income grant as a part of the survival mechanism. And it's interesting, people don't realize certain things about, I should just say this about health systems and a national public health system and the basic income grant. They think that it's for the poor or it's only for the vulnerable. What they don't realize that in a society that's governed by human rights, that's under the Declaration of Human Rights, if you have a good social security system, it's a floor that protects everyone. So today you might have a good medical aid. Tomorrow you could lose your job. And then when you fall, you will fall onto that floor and it will hold you. And that's in terms of our understanding of basic human rights and justice. You also should have that floor. So when we say there should be a universal basic income grant, what we mean is that even though a certain amount is given to every person, the tax system will be used to get it back from those people who are actually way above, suppose, the basic line of survival. And then that will come back into the system. But it does mean that one day when those people do fall, many in the middle class, they will also then be able to rely on at least having 1,000 rand that you can get up, you can get some food, you can actually take public transport to look for a job, and so on. So some of the things that, I mean, looking back, we could have negotiated in the transition was the idea that, in fact, you're a rich country. You've got gold mines, diamond mines, platinum. You're a country that actually can afford that. In fact, it's not going to be much more according to the calculations than, in fact, our current welfare systems. They do have it in certain places like Saudi Arabia and other countries where, in fact, they're particularly countries which have oil resources. So this economic thing, I think, we didn't address it in that period of the 90s during the negotiations, and it's going to sit with us for a long, long time until we can get back to finding ways to address it. We need the political will, we need the courage to do it, and we need to actually pay attention to some practical measures that are being used in other countries and which have been presented to us. The only two ways in which the economy came up in the RDP document was that it said that we need to have economic growth because we cannot have economic growth without addressing, we cannot afford not to have economic growth while addressing the backlogs because there might not be enough resources. Therefore, we need an economy which continues to grow. So that was, clearly not as the transformative part. Then the transformative part in that said we need to promote a huge small business sector. Also, it said we need to promote labor-based employment. So the kinds of industries that would absorb more of the unemployed. So those were the main things in there. That part of the RDP document also talked about, I suppose, a fiscal conservative, about fiscal restraint. And when you take that approach, you can see how it begins to clash with your approaches of meeting the backlogs. We did help people. In fact, we did reduce poverty in the early 90s through a couple of means and measures that we did undertake. So, for example, in housing, about 1 million houses were built in that first period of the first government. Secondly, we built 500 new clinics, making sure the clinics are nearer to people, especially in the rural areas where they were. So there were a couple of things that we produced there. There was also access to water as well that we laid on for people.
Okay. So, but I want you to stop you there, because I first wanted to talk just a little bit about then we move into the new South Africa, new part of that first government, right? And if you can talk about, like, okay, firstly, what that felt like, what that must have felt like, both the elation, I suppose, and then this ginormous task ahead, and what that ginormous task was, because what was the feeling, what was your role, and then what was this task ahead?
So it was an exciting period. You remember that Mandela stood on the Union buildings and he gave his speech and the planes flew over. It was very much like that, the Mandela moment and the Obama moments were like similar. Who would have thought, a black president? In fact, Brenda Fassie was very visionary when she sang the song Black President.
I love that song.
Yeah. So I guess so you've got these two feelings. You've got this feeling of excitement about going in and having the chance to transform things, but you also have this nervousness, this apprehension about how strong and how resilient and resistant the old is, and what it will take to make those changes. And so immediately you get in there, you're thinking of this topic of the first 100 days, because you know from experiences of other countries that after an election, people always talk about the first 100 days, and they try and put some things out that will happen quickly and really give people that payoff for their participation in the elections. You're also worried about the problem of over-promising, and under-delivering. So you step into those things and you're finding your way. And before you realize it, actually, the whole first year has passed, because of the mechanics of it all. There are many, many people in employment in government departments. They're being allocated to you. You're trying to redesign your government departments. You're seeing what are the ways you can reallocate money from old forms of expenditure to new forms of expenditure very quickly. And at the same time, you're also seeing whether with other money that's not part of all of that in fact you can do some quick deliveries of particular things by programs that almost sits outside of this bureaucratic thing. So an example of that is if you can get a whole lot of contractors and you can put pipes in the ground and deliver pipe water to people using some donor funds quite quickly, that would be good to do. It's also a bit risky because you might in fact be encouraging the others who are in the government departments and who have the budgets to stay within their comfort zones. So you have that as well. So you're trying to manage that kind of thing, to do those immediate delivery on things like provision of water and the provision of the RDP houses. So I was then in the RDP office, and our main thing was to get a piece of legislation to Parliament called the RDP Act, which I think towards the end of '94 we got it through. And that then allows you to do these things, to say you can actually allocate money to government departments to do things almost with a parallel budget. Our second role, apart from getting that act through, was to work with all government departments to say, let's go through your budget, your resources, your human resources as well, and see how we can reallocate to start serving the Black communities. In some of the departments, we had to help them with the unification of all the departments, the education departments, and help them with the policy for the new Schools Act, for example, which would in fact combine all the different school systems, but to be a support. But we were only 12 people in the RDP office, so you can imagine that there wasn't a lot of us to go around. So we had to focus on key departments. Department of Education, we gave a lot of assistance to. Department of Health, we gave a great deal of assistance to. And then we were engaging with the Department of Housing. And then there was a department which was called the Department of Intergovernmental Affairs. And that was really the department that we handle the local government issues, similar to COCTA now. Valley Musa wasn't there. We worked closely with that department. And that was our job. Well, our job was saying, do not ask the RDP office for millions of rands to deal with something that's within your mandate before you start looking at the resources you have. So in some cases, we came into conflict with certain departments, and certain departments told us to get lost. They didn't want to hear from us. So we had to find a way of working which says, we are here to help you, to assist you, we are here at your service. So part of why the RDP office then was abolished was that many ministers who were ministers in their own right complained to Thabo Mbeki that they did not like to have a department in the office of the president, I suppose, towering over them and looking over their shoulder at what they're doing. They objected. They were in exile. They were ministers in their own right. Why should there be a super minister which has more clout? At one point, at one of the ANC congresses, our minister went there and he was asked to stand for a position on the NEC, National Executive Committee, and he didn't stand. He actually stepped out of the NEC, which we felt was I guess, was a misstep on his part, because this was the engine room of the political party that had the reins to power, and you needed to be there, and you needed to be working on the things that were happening in this combination of Shell House, Luthuli House, so that in fact your standing within the political circles could be strong. So we lost a bit more ground in that way. And eventually we got to a situation where the president of the country, after a while, at the point where it was now Thabo Mbeki, was not even meeting with our minister to get reports, to find out what the progress is, and to give him backing on key issues, which meant he was out in the cold. And then there were these other key ministers who were very strong in the African National Congress and close to him. In the end, Thabo Mbeki, when he did announce the closure of the RDP, he said, well, actually, we shouldn't have parallel systems. We should just make RDP a very generic thing within government. We should just have the faith that all ministers would abide by it, and that the bureaucracy would, would understand what the Reconstruction and Development Programme means, would start to shift the emphasis from serving minority white community and the two other communities and serve the broader mass of South Africans. And we should actually just accept that that would be the case, but it was far too soon. The bureaucracy was still what it was. It just worked at its own pace and in its own ways. We were using the little money we had of the RDP as carrot and stick. And we said, if you can reprioritize so much from the white areas in Joburg to the black areas, we will add several tens of millions to your budget for you to deliver these other services and new services. And it was a system that was really starting to work well and take a root.
Wow.
But in the end, by, I think, 1997, the RDP was disbanded, and that transformative work could no longer continue.
Yeah. Sure.
And so we then started to, very soon after that, we had the what was called the GEAR program.
Yes, yes.
And we and many people believe that this growth program of government, this GEAR program, was supplanting the RDP.
Right.
But of course, many people within government who were part of the mainstream and who were working with Meintjies said, but actually, we don't see it that way. We think the RDP is still valid, but we are implementing GEAR. So when they implemented GEAR, it meant a lot more fiscal restraint. It meant a lot more incentives for business. And once you have incentives for business, you know that in fact you then have to allow more tax breaks, which means that you are starting to shift resources away from the issue of social infrastructure for the people. You have less resources for that and more resources for incentives to create employment. And with all these new programs that emerged like GEAR and Hlanganisa, we in fact did not get what was promised. In one case, we were promised 1 million new jobs. It didn't materialize. In fact, in some of those cases, we sometimes had a net job loss.
Yeah.
So that was the path we then took. I think that is the other thing that is probably signaled by removing the RDP and removing Jane Ida out of that position was a weakening, I guess, of some of the social partners in the transition. So Jay was a minister that came from COSATU, from the labor movement, and had an interest in actually seeing through some of these transformations that were in the Reconstruction and Development Programme, particularly on the social side, health, education, meeting the backlog of social services, land. A keen interest in addressing that was moved to the side, was reshuffled into a portfolio where these particular objectives couldn't be pursued as vigorously.
Yeah.
So it meant then, I guess, a weakening of the kind of voices within the alliance that would take these things forward. And so we were starting to get by 1999 into, I guess, a much more slowing down of RDP delivery.
Yeah.
So when government to this day, the ANC, the Congress movement, and government talks about what was delivered in the years since liberation, most of the things they refer to were actually delivered in that first 5 years. They talk about millions of houses, piped water, electricity. In fact, some of those things went into disuse or dysfunction over time. So, for example, when Minister Kada Asmal became the Minister of Water Affairs, he called himself jokingly, informally, when he was chatting to us, the Minister of Dry Taps. And the reason was that the water systems set up in the rural areas were no longer functioning. And we had, through government programs and NGO programs, together with local water committees, had these capital projects where these things were put up in the communities, and then the process involved collecting like a 5 rand from each household per month, so that you actually fix anything that's broken, buy some petrol for the water pump, and if the pump needed a service, they could be taken into town and fixed. All of those things were not sustained because of, I guess, you're not doing the field work and the extension work, not mobilizing people and maintaining people. So many of the people went back to the river to fetch water. And the same happened with, I suppose, the provision of electricity. You know, more and more people are unemployed. They, in fact, are not able to pay because your economic circumstances are not improving. You get electricity cut-offs. And so the only way, after those problems became quite severe, government then said, we want to actually pass some laws which call for a minimum basic provision of water and a very low cost for your first levels of electricity. So government has tried to address that in that way. But there were clashes between people in communities around payment for services, around issues of meters and so on. And these were the setbacks. So many of the RDP gains were reversed, but we have to see that many of the major achievements were in those first 5 years.